Hey, everybody, it's Kathleen Burns Kingsbury, and we're going to have some fun today on my live about negotiating. And today, specifically, we're going to talk about negotiating with a sponsor. So, what is a sponsor? A sponsor is somebody who pays you to either podcast, blog, give a speech, sometimes be a spokesperson. There's a variety of types of sponsorship. Today, we're going to talk primarily about podcast sponsorship or blog sponsorship. But just know that these tips do apply to a variety of sponsorships. So, what typically can happen is if you have a successful podcast, a successful blog, or something like a speaking career that is successful, you will get sponsors who will pay you to basically sponsor you, which in some ways is a very soft advertising. And so with a sponsorship, what you need to deliver is access to a curated list, and the sponsor gets to be put in front of that list. So it is a really useful tool for podcast hosts to either cover their marketing expenses, or for many, it is a way to increase revenue. I know speaking in certain industries, sponsorship is really where it's at. So often they won't have budget to have you in at your full fee, but they will have a sponsor who's willing to sponsor your fee and get in front of the audience that you are talking to. And I know, and I've never done the sponsored blog, but I have heard about sponsored blogs where people want to get their name out in front of a particular audience and you have access to it. So sponsorship is a really cool thing. For years, I put off getting a sponsor, and then I decided, well, this is crazy. If I get sponsorships in other areas of my life. So for speaking, I've worked with sponsors for years and years, maybe a decade and a half. But with my podcast, I always thought, I'm not successful enough. I don't have a big enough audience. I don't have this or that or whatever. So I really talked myself out of getting a sponsor. But what I discovered when I took the risk to say, oh, well, let's just see if somebody would sponsor my podcast, that I was quite popular, and that what my sponsors wanted from me was the value that I provide in terms of access to a particular audience, saving them time and money because they don't have to create their own podcast, jumping on my credibility because I had built up a lot of trust with my audience and a lot of credibility that I'm the real deal. And that sponsorship was just a way of partnering or collaborating. And so far, with any of my sponsors, it's worked really, really well. So this morning, I wanted to share with you what are some of the questions you need to be asking yourself, and how do you negotiate a sponsorship agreement. So I thought about, what are the questions that you should ask yourself, or if I'm coaching somebody, I would ask them to start to determine whether sponsorship makes sense for you, and then how to negotiate the sponsorship. So the first question is, and it's a key question, what value do I provide a potential sponsor, right? Because people aren't going to pay you just to pay you. Look at famous people and celebrities. Do you know why Serena Williams advertises, or why, I don't know, Tom Brady is in advertisements? The reason is that they provide value to the sponsor. So, well, I am not a celebrity athlete, and maybe you aren't either. What is important is to determine the value you provide. So the first question is, what value can I provide a sponsor? Now, there's a couple of different ways of looking at it, right? Your sponsor is going to want to get in front of the audience that you have for your podcast. And in some ways, part of the value you provide is a warm introduction to your audience. So when somebody is sponsoring, say, the Breaking Money Silence podcast, it is a warm introduction to my audience, where I start and end each episode mentioning the sponsor and a little bit about them. So warm introduction is actually worth a lot because it increases brand awareness. It allows maybe new products or new services to be put in front of your podcast listeners. Now, again, this can apply to a blog. This can apply to getting in front of a group of people while you're speaking at a conference. But in terms of a podcast, think about it as it's a warm introduction. The other thing that sponsors want is they ultimately want new customers, right? Who doesn't? They want new clients, but they want to increase their followers. So maybe they're using a sponsorship to boost their social presence. And so maybe you have a lot of followers on a particular social platform. Of course, the big ones are Facebook, YouTube, LinkedIn, and what's that other small one? Oh, Instagram. And I know there's some others as well, but those are kind of the bigger ones, at least in the industry that I work in. And so people want more followers. So if they see you as a sponsor, or they come to my podcast and see that there's a sponsorship and there's an easy button to then follow that sponsor on social, that's going to increase their social media contacts, which, by the way, has a lot of value. They also want to increase and will measure some of the success by the number of downloads you have. So if you have 2 downloads per episode, you're probably not ready for sponsorship. But if you have 200, 250, 1,000, 10,000, you are ready for sponsorship. So it's a warm introduction for the sponsor. It is helping them get social media followers. It's helping them gain that credibility of being associated with you. And it also sometimes or often is measured in the number of downloads. And why the number of downloads? Because downloads is a way to measure who's actually listening to the podcast. The dilemma with downloads is a lot of the platforms out there, especially at the basic level, don't give you a lot of detailed statistics, but they give you enough to be able to show a sponsor that you're getting a certain number of downloads per episode, and over a course of time, a certain number of downloads. So just know that downloads are important, especially when it comes to podcasts. The other thing I want to say is that with a sponsor, some sponsors actually want to do their own podcast, but they decide it's going to save them a lot of time and actually cost them a lot less to sponsor the Breaking Money Silence podcast than it is to create their own. So that is another value that you provide, getting them out there podcasting, so to speak, and also in front of these audiences. Sometimes people will sponsor and then test and say, oh, you know what? I really like this. I'm going to do my own podcast. So the first and most important question is, what value can you provide to your sponsor? Because people pay for value. So you need to be able to talk about that. You need to be able to present that in a written format of, here's the value that I provide. And you need to really know who that audience is you're putting them in front of. So for me, my audience is a combination. Breaking Money Silence podcast is really targeted towards women in business and the financial advisors that serve them. So if I have a sponsor that's interested in getting in front of one or both of those audiences, that's going to be of value to them. The last thing, and I left this out, is links. So sometimes sponsors will say, well, I want a link. So they are mentioned as a sponsor. There's a link mentioned in the write-up. There's a link, and that link tracks how many people go from your podcast write-up or podcast listening to their actual website. So that's another measurement just to be aware of. Again, you don't have a lot of control over what ends up happening when somebody sponsors you. So it's really building up that momentum and then offering it to sponsorship and then working your little bejeebies off to make sure that your sponsors are happy. Why? Because sponsors are clients. So keep in mind, don't be entitled around sponsorship. Sponsors are actually clients. I treat my sponsors really, really good. I make sure that they're happy. Sometimes I invite them to be on as a guest. That isn't part of the package. But if I want to have them on and they're going to add value to my audience and it's going to make sense for our partnership, then I go ahead and do it. So value, value, value. So what's the second thing you need to be thinking about? You need to be thinking about, can you deliver? So, okay, you have value to provide. We all have value to provide. But can you deliver? And when I say that, if you are podcasting and say you podcast and you have an 8-session or an 8-episode series, then you're going to want to have a sponsor for those 8 episodes. You're going to want to be really clear that what you're promising is a sponsorship for 8 episodes. Now, if you have a podcast like I do, which runs pretty much every week with a few exceptions, then you are offering your sponsor a year-long sponsorship and at various different levels. But I have to commit, just like you would have to commit, to making sure that I can deliver. So if I have a week where I say, I really want a podcast, or I can't think of a guest to bring on. So, you know what? I'm just going to drink coffee and podcast later. That's not going to work because you need to deliver. When you have a sponsor, it isn't just I'm going to market. It's you better get out there and have that consistency. It's good anyway. But just know if you're going to sign up and you are going to deliver for a sponsor, you need to have a real commitment to what you're signing up for, and you need to make sure you have that consistency. Doesn't matter if you're doing just a series or if you're doing a year or if you're doing every other week, just make sure you are consistent. It's a good idea anyway, but it is a must when you have a sponsor. I think another thing you need to think about in terms of can you deliver is, can you deliver that brand awareness? In what ways will your sponsor get brand awareness? So my package includes that they get an intro and outro. They get to be on my actual podcast page and write-up. They get to be tagged in social media in a variety of different ways, depending on their level of sponsorship. So you want to make sure that when you're promising them brand awareness, you're going to give them as many opportunities as they can get to get that brand awareness associated with the podcast, because a happy sponsor is a sponsor that renews their sponsor contract, is a happy client. You're also going to want to think about, can you deliver in terms of getting traffic to their website? So this is the version where you put a link or you mention a link or you do both, and that your sponsorship is actually measured on how many people go from your website or your podcast platform to theirs. Now, again, you don't have control over that. Your message might be a little bit different when you are getting measured by that link to their website than it is in terms of brand awareness. But again, you got to make sure you deliver, and you got to make sure that you are doing what you can. There's another type of sponsorship, which I haven't participated in, but I know about, which is you get paid not for the sponsorship, not for being on the podcast page, not for being mentioned, but each time a sale has been made. I feel like that's more of an advertisement than actually a sponsor, but a lot of people do that. So if I say, you know what, and of course, Apple is not a sponsor of mine, but if Apple's out there and wants to be. So suppose I say, okay, I'm going to mention iPhones on my podcast. And if I mention iPhones, anybody who goes to a link and actually buys an iPhone as a result of hearing it on my podcast, I will get a percentage of that sale. So a lot of people do it. It just happens to be a measure that doesn't work for my podcast, but might work for yours. What else? I think the other thing in terms of delivering is sometimes people want endorsements, right? So they not only want you to mention this podcast is sponsored by, they want you to say, this product, this service is excellent. I love it. And here's why I love it. That's an endorsement. That's a little bit different than just having them sponsor a podcast. You're also saying, I really think you should buy this product. Now, with that said, know that you should pick your sponsors carefully. My opinion only, but they should fit with your brand. You should like these people. You should trust these people. You should make sure that you're in alignment as to what your goals are, because it is your name and reputation, whether you outwardly and verbally endorse them, or whether you are simply saying that they're sponsors of your podcast. You want to make sure that that feels comfortable. Now, some people might take any type of sponsorship and say that I'm overthinking it, but for me and my brand, it's based on trust. It's based on being genuine. It's based on me bringing resources to women in business and financial professionals that they can count on. So for me, there is actually a vetting process that happens with a podcast sponsor, and I have turned people away. So just keep that in mind. So what value can I provide? What can I deliver? So those are connected, but they're important to think about separately, because once you make a commitment to a sponsor, you need to deliver, because otherwise they're not going to get value for their sponsorship. You're not going to deliver, and it really is going to be a very short-term situation. So how is sponsorship measured? So you need to think about, this is the third question, how am I going to measure the effectiveness of my sponsorship? Am I going to measure it at all? I like to provide some reporting in terms of downloads, in terms of social e-blast, social contacts. In general, where has your sponsorship been seen? And then I leave it up to the firm to decide how much more they're going to track it. But again, if you agree to percentage of sales, if you agree to a certain link and a certain number of downloads, you need to make sure that you are reporting on that. And what I like to do is depending on the length of the sponsorship, report on that monthly. So if it is a series sponsor, they get 2 reports. If it is a year-long sponsor, they get monthly reports. And so that reporting keeps the line of communication open. It can be simple, but it needs to be done in order to show and continue to show your value and that you've delivered. So the last thing I will leave you this morning with, when it comes to negotiating a sponsorship and when it comes to thinking about what are the questions you need to be asking yourself before you ask for money for a sponsorship, is put it in writing. I am not a lawyer. I don't pretend to be a lawyer. You want to consult a lawyer. I put everything in writing. So it could be a 1-page agreement. It could be an agreement that is more complicated. But I think spelling out what's the value you're going to provide, what's the price you're going to charge, how are you going to deliver, and how are you going to report on things? And in return, are there some deliverables that your sponsor needs to give you, headshots, taglines, logos, anything like that? Then that should be in the agreement as well. Get it signed, give a copy to everybody, and keep it official. You may trust this sponsor and think they're wonderful. They may be a friend of yours. But if there's ever a disagreement, even if it's a little small misunderstanding, having a document in writing to go back to just makes it easier to clear up. It's also, quite frankly, a professional thing to do. So are you ready for sponsorship? I know I am. And I've had some great sponsors, and I look forward to some great sponsors in the future. So I know today we talked about the things that you needed to consider in order to start to negotiate with a podcast sponsor. What I will be doing in 2 weeks, because I am going on vacation, or we'll be camping next Tuesday, and I won't be having access to live, and you wouldn't want to see me as I look camping. And so in 2 weeks, I will be talking about negotiating the actual deal. So what do you need to be aware of to negotiate the deal once you have all these ducks in a row? So this is Kathleen Burns Kingsbury. I love talking about negotiating. I love helping you with your business. And if you want to check out my new website, it's breakingmoneysilence.com. There are free resources. There's access to my podcast. There's access to free money talk tips, 52 money talk tips that come right to your inbox. Doesn't cost you anything, and it's a great way to continue to break money silence every week. And of course, there is my free course on negotiating. You can go to breakingmoneysilence.com and look for that, or you can go to breakingmoneysilence.com/negotiating for free. And I'm going to put that in the chat right now for anybody who can see it before I head out. So thank you so much for tuning in to my Breaking Money Silence on Negotiating tip of the day. We talked a lot about sponsorship today, and we will continue to talk about sponsorship in 2 weeks. So I will see you soon. I hope you have a great Tuesday, and get out there and break money silence.